Hi, friends. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we have all kinds of fun conversations related to regenerating soil health, regenerating public health, and everything that's in between those two things: nutrition management, nutrient density, improving plant health, better agronomy management, better soil health, and you can imagine the spectrum. So today, I'm here with Jason Rowntree from Michigan. Jason's someone I've wanted to have here for quite some time, and it's taken some time to put together to make it happen. Jason, you've been doing some work that I'm very intrigued in the nutrient density space and producing with a particular focus and emphasis on producing healthier, higher quality food. This is a topic I've been passionate about for almost 20 years, and I've seen lots of people talking and doing some things, particularly in the fruit and vegetable space, that clearly produce better quality fruit, better flavor, better aroma. Um, but one of the things that hasn't happened a lot, we haven't had a lot of people doing a lot of measuring and actually measuring what the improvements are, what's actually happening, what's really going on. And it's my understanding that this has been there's been a recent resurgence where there's quite a number of new people coming into the space who are actually measuring, who are doing things. But it's my understanding you've been doing this for quite some time. Tell us a little bit about your story, your history, your background, the journey you've been on, and the scope of the work that you're working on.
Oh, you bet. Thanks for having me, John. It's good. I think we met in Chicago, and we were like kindred spirits. And it's just taken a while to get back together. Almost a year, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I was trained traditionally. Got a PhD in animal science nutrition, and did it at Michigan State in the late '90s, early 2000s, and then the job closest to home in Texas was at LSU. So my wife and son and I at the time we went down to Baton Rouge to be closer to family, and I worked down there doing beef cattle work for several years. And during that time frame, we got hit by Katrina, and I didn't realize that I was going to be doing relief and recovery efforts after massive hurricanes. We had Rita hit that same year in '05, and it wasn't this ooh ah moment, and I had light bulbs going off everywhere, but I saw a completely devastated landscape, and it got me to thinking about resilience. And I was thinking at the time low input ag. I don't, at that time regenerative wasn't really a key term, and sustainable was pretty popular. But I kind of thought about low input. What does it look like to take fossil fuel out of beef cattle, out of our grazing systems? And so a few years later, I had the opportunity to come back to MSU. And so I've been up here for 16 years, where I oversee a research center, Lake City, which is up around Traverse City. I also do work up in the Upper Peninsula. And so we have like a two-pronged approach to our work, where I'm very interested in how grazing management influences uh, ecosystem function. And then I also have been very interested in how we manage cattle and how we feed cattle, and what implications that has on beef nutrient density. And hopefully over time, we still haven't gotten there, but to look at the side of human health as well. And so we've been looking at different um, ways of grass finishing, supplements, grain finishing, etc., and what that does to the meat. And so we've been doing that piece as well. And so it's all under that kind of Sir Albert Howard, kind of a premise of, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people.
Yeah, all of those things integrate. I think anyone who's paying attention doesn't have any questions about that concept anymore. But where the questions evolve is how do we implement it? What actually matters? What actually makes a difference? So let's get into maybe a little bit of the animal nutrition and the nutrient density pieces. What are the factors that actually contribute to producing higher quality, healthier beef?
And first of all, I'm going to not play the neutral academic on your show here or anything, right? But I've always kind of thought about this in different levels of nutrient density, right? Where, I go to my local grocery store, and I see way too many people shopping way too much in the middle aisles. And, if I've got a box of cereal or a 3-ounce portion of a regular product of beef bought at the grocery store, I would much rather see that nutrient density, from beef and meat, period, as compared to a box of Rice Krispies. No offense to my rice farmer friends in Louisiana, but do you see the context, right? Like there's different levels of nutrient density, right? Like don't eat crap, eat real food is one level. But then we can evolve and say, oh well, man, there are millions of phytochemicals out there that we know nothing about, but we do know they have uh, anti-inflammatory principles, and we can see differences in those based on how we finish cattle. And so we have set up trials for over 10 years now that test different finishing strategies. Um, what I can tell you is probably what goes into the animal in the last 30 to 60 days is the most important.
That's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, it can really alter nutrient densities based on that last period of finishing. And so, how we finish cattle in those last 30 to 60 days seem to have the greatest impact. Same in rodent trials as well when you look at that.
So hang on. I just want to make sure we're understanding this clearly. So you're suggesting that um, if we feed cattle in such a way, let's say that produces low phytonutrient content and has a broad omega-3 to omega-6 ratio,
Yep.
we can change the diet in the last 60 days and significantly change those fatty acid ratios and change the phytonutrient content in the last 60 days.
Yes. Yes. And it's really the turnover of nutrients, right? Like there's all these things going on. It's probably too complex. But we can really like improve nutrient density by what goes into them in that last period of time. That is the most important time period as we finish animals. And often, if you think about it, like let's say in a grass finishing system in the upper Midwest, well, if we're on a 18 to 20-month period of time, a fast, often we're going into stored forages in the wintertime, right?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
or, we can go into a 2 to 2.5 year cycle and we can be finishing off fresh forages.
Yep.
And stored forages and fresh forages have different nutrient content, and therefore can impart different nutrient profiles on the beef during that time period. I could be cynical, right? I love grass finishing. Okay, we know the challenges we have in commodity beef production. It is highly efficient, however, but I could probably put a lot of good foo-foo dust in a feed yard diet the last 30, 60 days and mimic, different omega 3s or other things like that as well if I wanted to.
Well, that's the one example of that I'm familiar with is the work that Pierre Vale and his colleagues and collaborators have been doing in Europe with Blue Blanc Core, where they're doing exactly that. They're feeding flax in particular. I think I don't know if that's limited to just the last 30 to 60 days. I think that might be the entire duration
Mhm,
of the cattle life cycle, where they are deliberately and intentionally producing a particular omega-3 to 6 essential fatty acid ratio.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to step back and kind of tell you the beginning of this story.
Yeah,
Um,
please.
I've had a really good working relationship with Green Acres Foundation. They're outside of Cincinnati, and they reached out to me at a grass fed exchange down in Georgia. So I'm guessing that was like 14, maybe somewhere 15, when Will Harris hosted down there. And they said, "Hey, we want to do a survey of all the grass finished beef in the United States." And Alan Williams would have been a part of this project, who does a lot of work in this area. And so we set up a blind sample, meaning we didn't know who the packer or who the farmer was. They were farmer A, B, C, D, packer A, B, C, D. And so we collected about 800, 900 samples across the year, so spring, fall. And we had beef coming from small local producers or small regional producers all the way up to big commercial brands that marketed grass fed. And so we ran nutrient density on those. Primarily fatty acids were our big look, but we also looked at vitamins and fat solubles, specifically. And what we found, John, was massive variation. That grass finished beef isn't just grass finished beef. Um, you're sitting down, which is good because we actually found what was being marketed as grass finished we found ratios that were 20-1 N6 to N3 or greater.
It makes you question the integrity of the label of grass-fed.
It really makes you wonder because it could be, what sources are all these N6s coming from? Highly linoleic, which we know is, a soybean, right? Um, we saw ratios that were spot on, right? Like 1-1, really, really good, right? High content of, DPA, AHA, stuff like that, right? Um, and interestingly, all of the beef that had very high N6s had almost no fat soluble vitamins. Like in terms of picking up vitamin E, for example, we couldn't find it in a lot of
So,
those samples.
what do you think was this coming from stored forages? Why the discrepancy when you have some beef that
Well, that's a great question because we've been trying to chase that answer for the last 10 years. And so we have set up trials feeding distillers, feeding soy hull pellets. We fed grapeseed oils. We fed all these different types of supplements with grass. Never been able to replicate that high of a N6 ratio. I would think, honestly, it would have to be coming from some kind of a soybean baleage or something of that nature, but we've never been able to actually replicate it. We've fed a lot of soy holes with, and some brands allow a certain percentage of these things to go in and still call them grass fed, and we can alter it a little bit, maybe 4-6-1, like a better end of a grain fed, but never been able to 100% replicate it. And it's interesting to me. But what we've also started doing is we started also working with Stefan Van Vliet out that worked with Fred. Fred Provenz has been a huge influence on both Stefan and myself over the years, right? And Fred is the master on this. I mean, I give umbrage to him, and a lot of this is his influence on me. But we've also started to do a lot of metabologenomics work on this meat, where we're looking at the metabolites, we're looking at the gene expressions, and we actually just published a paper in Nature, Nature Food, which for a redneck from Texas to be in Nature Food is quite the accomplishment. And but what Lucas found, Lucas was the PhD postdoc working on this, is that looking at the metabologenomics, we could tell with 100% accuracy that an animal was grass fed. We could look at the metabolites and be able to predict it every time that it was grass fed. If we
and is
fed
that
all
also true of stored forages?
it, we with supplements, it's true. We found that if you fed like a soybean, distillers, or some kind of a combination,
Yeah.
we could 100% predict it based on the metabolites, more so than just fatty acids. Okay, and whenever the question you come into is stored forages or those types of things, we could hit it about 50% of the time. And so we've been searching for these markers that can 100% with authenticity label grass-fed beef. And we can do that. Typically the metabolites that increase are like citric acid, succinic acid, kind of some of these steps and anti-inflammatories, things like that. I could kind of go on. I nerd out on it a bit, but
Well, that's why we're having this conversation to nerd out
yeah,
on a bit. So don't hold back, by all
yeah,
means.
yeah. So
So
um,
let's establish a bit of a baseline, if we can, for people who are just catching up to this conversation. What is the? I'm going back to fatty acids because that's what lots of people are familiar with. But what is the ranges? What's the spectrum of fatty acid profiles that is reasonable? And what's the spectrum of metabolic expression that you are observing? Are we talking 5x variation, 10x variation in different compounds? What are
no,
the?
much
Yep,
less. Yeah, great
yep.
questions. So fatty acid ratios typically. I worked with Dr. Jen Fenton here. She's our go-to nutritionist that does a lot of this work. She's my neighbor, and generally our grass-fed, the probably the greatest N6 to N3 ratios we see are about 3-1. On average, grain fed will be probably 6 to 8 to 1. Um, Very often we see uh, grass fed beef that is 1 to 1, and and as I've just commented, we've seen quote unquote grass fed beef range all the way up to 20 to 1. And so it isn't a bad marker. What's really interesting to me is which fatty acids are pronounced.
Yep.
Um, there's
That was
recently a
exactly the
paper
next question I was going to ask.
from the University of Chicago that doing cell culture work showed that transvicinic acid, which would be a 18 carbon fatty acid, I believe, with one unsaturated bond, but it's got a bend to it, and so it's kind of like a conjugated, right? At the 11th carbon, uh, it's highly anti-inflammatory and shown to be anti-carcinogenic, right? This transvicinic acid. And I went back and looked at the expression or the content of that in our grass-fed samples, and looking at probably a 6 to 7 fold increase of TVA in our grass-fed versus our grain-fed, um, which means it's coming from forages. And very interesting and very potentially impactful. Now, if I could be cynical for a minute, or kind of, it was really funny to me in this big University of Chicago paper that while they showed this fatty acid that's highly profound in meat and milk has all these anti-carcinogenic factors, they wanted you to be really aware that they don't think you should be eating more red meat, however. And so they went into this whole, cover your rear end deal, right? In terms of, we don't want to say that. But the point is that we do see that we see without question considerably greater conjugated linoleic acid (CLA), which as well is a very highly anti-carcinogenic fatty acid. Interestingly, TVA is the precursor for CLA, and so we see these really nice anti-inflammatory factors. Typically in grain fed, you're going to see greater like 16-0 and 18-0, which would be like palmitic acid and stearic acid. And I always laugh because when you look at the sensory trials in beef, um, generally people think the best tasting beef, they link it back to what the content of it is, and it's always got a lot of saturated fat in it. So we've been genetically programmed to seek out saturated fat. We like it; it tastes good. Often we do see our grain fed have greater saturated fats, um, and we've picked up variation with grass fed where sometimes they are higher, but it's all part of really what happens in the rumen.
Yeah.
Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, you mentioned a word that made me laugh because it was literally the next word that I've written down that I wanted to ask you about, and that is inflammation, anti-inflammatory fats. So, the work that Blue Blancourt did a couple of decades ago was they actually did human health studies and clinical trials where they documented that animal products grown with um, narrow omega-3 to 6 fatty acid ratios. And again, it's my understanding they were producing this using flax, but they documented significant anti-inflammatory um, benefits as compared to pro-inflammatory benefits from just run-of-the-mill grocery store meat that was being produced in Europe. This was in France in particular. I think these studies were being done. What as you're looking at these different fats, you're describing some of them, some of these fatty acids as having anti-inflammatory effects. Would such an observation make sense to you? Are you able to see that in the metabolic profile?
Yes, yes, and it's often picked up in phytochemicals, right? And one thing that my lab partner, Dr. Fenton, has done has really worked to create an understanding of how to measure these phytochemicals in meat. It's often done in plants, but not in meat, and it's been a heavy lift to get that to work in the lab. Also working on eggs, pasture based versus more conventionally grown eggs, and so there will, without question, be 5, 6, 7, 8 phytochemicals that do tend to pop up in greater concentrations. I also want to be clear, John, like in our work, we've stopped at the meat, right? Like we've never fed it to humans. We've
Yeah.
never followed anti or pro-inflammatory metabolites
Right.
uh, postprandially after a human eats a meal. But
Well,
so
so we
there's
we
still a
do
meat.
understand the effects these compounds have to some degree.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so yes, it we can pick it up. And then the other part of the equation is that, vitamin E is an anti-inflammatory, right? And others and so there's just a combination of nutrients that we do see uh in our grass finished meat that appears to be superior. um, does that mean for me, like again, I look at the state of human health in this country, right? Like it's almost I don't want to say we're having an elitist discussion on these nuances, right? But I think I go back to the real challenges we have with obesity in this country and
Right.
these other issues, and and so I always want to put context around that, right? Because I'd
Yep.
much rather see people eating nutrient dense meat versus all the stuff in the boxes from the grocery store or in the bottles. And so but it is awesome to see that there are ways that we can go back to really eating how we were programmed to eat, and see why these animals have these different compounds. And it really, at the end of the day, comes from forages, right? And we can follow forages and typically find that these compounds are greater in peak photosynthesis. And you would expect that.
So when you say peak photosynthesis, do you mean peak vegetative growth?
Yes.
Yeah.
When we are seeing, that the plants around the summer solstice, those time periods, um, cool season grasses, mind you, we pick up these cool season, our big cool season flush. That's when we see them. They tend to decrease in the latter summer as we hit our summer slumps. And then we pick them back up in the fall when we get that second rush of grass when it cools off in the fall time. But those are the peak areas that we typically see greater concentrations of these in the plants.
And it is okay. And is this what's the context of the observations that you just made? Is this relative to your local environment there in Michigan? What if someone is grazing beef in Florida and on warm season grasses, for example?
Yeah, it would be completely different.
Yeah.
And it could arguably be peaked again when the soil temperatures are getting up into the 70s and 80s, right? and
Yeah.
and so when that happens here, it's like our grasses say adios. we're
Yeah.
not we're not going to go.
Yeah. So what is the what are the factors that can be contributed from, I'll just broadly call them medicinal plants rather than just grasses and forbs. So I've been fascinated by this study of looking at how plants influence each other, and I've come to the conclusion that many of these plant species that we might consider as being medicinal or having medicinal value, nutraceutical value for people, such as Artemisia wormwood, for example, is one of the plants that has been documented as inhibiting or reducing mildew pressure when it's present in orchards. So these plants are having medicinal value not just for people, but I would contend also for other plants that are in there that are in close proximity. And we don't know exactly what close proximity means. It might mean a couple of yards or a couple hundred yards or maybe longer. We're still figuring that out. But you've been defining this conversation largely in terms of the metabolomics that show up from forages, from grass in particular.
Mhm.
What is the degree of influence of forbs and of having a diversity of plants that the livestock are grazing?
Yeah, absolutely, right. Great question. And we know from Dr. Provenza especially, right, that uh the interactions of these plants and how they communicate rhizobally is amazing, right? And so yeah, so in our context, you may have a plantain or a chicory that can work well in our mixes. Deep taprooted plants like chicory, um, all are going to generally photosynthesize at different wavelengths of light, right? Like that's the beauty of this, right? That and it's this the author, you know, they're the creation, right? Because it is so elegant that we know that all these different plants tend to photosynthesize at a little bit different wavelengths of light. Okay, so based on the time of day, based on the amount of light that they're getting, they will act a bit differently. There are some that are shallow taprooted, some that are deeper taprooted. Um, and as we know, the changes in soil types with microbial activity and all the things that you've talked about on your show with others are all going on at the same time, and all of those things combined lead to different plants having different nutrient profiles. We know that if an animal is provided as much diversity as possible, they will forage to it. They, especially in more Western range environments where you might have 100 or 150 different types of plants, including forbs, shrubs, other plants, very different. And an animal can graze to meet their nutrient requirements based on that. Um, humans think in a 100% trace mineral mix, and we throw that out there, and they're going to be great because we're not real complex thinkers, right? As compared to say like a cafeteria style mineral where we've got all these different minerals out, and a cow will eat different ones during the different types of year. And the point being then is that what you're asking is absolutely correct, that a chicory plant is going to have considerably different nutrient profile than maybe white clover. Um, and we can therefore see influences on the animal health and the concentrations based on that. You have just a monoculture. Well, that monoculture by itself is photosynthesizing at a certain wavelength. It's got a certain depth to its roots. It's only going to be doing one thing. And we obviously know the benefits of biodiversity, and your listeners as well, and how the greater amounts, the more productivity. I did a trial one time where we put, we took like one species cover, and then we took, it's been so long, dude, I'm getting old, man. But it was like we did, it was like oats, and then we did like oats and a brassica, and then we did like 10 or 12 different species. And the real cool thing is that the animals always gained the best on that most diverse cover. They most aptly graded choice, grass fed, mind you, on that most diverse cover.
Yep.
We got the greatest yields off the most diverse cover.
Yep.
Blah blah. I mean, it all lined up, right? And my other feeling is when you get into the cover game, you know a lot more about than I do. Is that much greater an opportunity for a seed to germinate?
Yep.
When I put more diversity out there, something's going to grow, right? Where if I'm only putting one thing out there, I've got one window, and so I really have enjoyed some of that. I've never, like, one of the biggest berated times in my career was by Gabe Brown. Gabe was visiting the farm, and I had this cool mix, and here I'm the academic trying to be cool, and I didn't have a warm season in it. I should have had like a sorghum Sudan in there, and man, Gabe let me know. he let me know that I needed to do a better job, right? And that's and I will say I'm so thankful that all these cool farmers have taken me under their wing because I'm an academic, right? I have worked closely with people like Gabe and Will Harris and others, and I mentioned Alan earlier, right? And but they've mentored me. They've helped me try to apply the things they see out in the field that I can apply in a research setting and provide that quantitative data you're talking about.
Yep. So I want to go back to the conversation around timing of the primal importance of the last 30 to 60 days relative to these forage metabolomics. If I recall correctly, we started this conversation a little bit focused on the fatty acids and how those profiles shift. But maybe the way to ask the question I want to be getting to is if livestock, if beef are fed a grain-centric diet, grain-oriented diet, and then switched in the last, let's call it the last 60 days, can you see in the metabolic profile, can you see the legacy of grain consumption?
That is a trial we haven't done, and it's on the list. Can I hypothesize?
Of course.
I think I can grain finish an animal for 4 months, kick him out on fresh, high quality forages. I think I can flip it. I think I could. You may not want to hear that, but I do think,
Oh, I don't, I don't have a contention here strongly, but
yeah,
I
right.
think there's a lot of people that would have interesting reactions to that speculation,
Well, because they're
both
really not
positive and
grass fed.
negative. I mean, there's a lot of people who would be inspired by the opportunity there because
Yeah.
that gives them the opportunity to produce a healthier, higher quality food with some system adaptations. And
Mhm.
then, of course, there are also people who would be who might be threatened by that. But the reality is, as I
Yeah.
perceive it, the market and the consumption for a quality grass-fed product is much bigger than our domestic supply currently.
It's I had an opportunity to work with a high a burger chain on the West Coast. I don't think I can say their name. You can probably intuit. And they were wanting to use domestic grass fed um,
There's not enough
through
out there.
through a few of their restaurants. And I flew out there, met the president, the CEO of the company, etc. And I think we did the math, and there was enough domestic grass fed grind in the United States to maybe keep like 3, 4, or 5 of their restaurants going the
Yeah,
entire year.
yeah.
And so ultimately, um, we you said a lot right there, by the way. But that the problem is, yeah, I mean, we need greater domestic supply. There's no doubt. Number two is that, I wouldn't the product would not be grass fed. It wouldn't be a grass fed product at that point, right? Like if you grain finished all the way up to a certain point, or use supplements or byproducts, and then kicked them out for that last 60 days. But I think it would be interesting to see what the nutrient profiles do read, right? Where if you're not a purist, if you don't care about that label, you just care about your health. There could be opportunities, I think, in some of those things there, that can. I'm not a purist. I'm a pragmatist, and whatever works for people, it works for people, right? And if I can grow some high quality grain, in my context, and I want to feed it to a ruminant, I'm not opposed to that by any means. But the point being is that, we can take within our own context and make things work.
I'm some interesting blend of idealist and pragmatist. And the practical aspect is that, as you've pointed out, to some extent, we're having a bit of an elitist conversation, and we recognize that meat quality exists on a spectrum.
Hmm.
If we can take 30%, I'm making up numbers here, but if we could take 30% of the existing meat supply chain and dramatically improve that quality by having it be on grass and on pasture instead of in feedlots for the last 60 days of its life, and shift large segments of the supply chain to produce a higher quality product for people, for the consuming public broadly, why would we choose not to do that?
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
you said I said a lot of different things in my statement earlier, and that one of the things that the words that are deliberately included is our domestic supply chain. The reality is that our grass-fed producers who are trying to market as grass-fed here in North America at the moment, particularly if they're looking for even a small premium, are at a disadvantage because grass-fed beef is being imported from Argentina and Australia and around the world at 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 prices that make it difficult to compete with or impossible.
Impossible.
Yeah,
And I work with, I make a trip out to Australia, and I've got colleagues out there, and it is the land that they have in Australia for grazing is so immense that their break evens, John, just
right,
dwarf ours.
right.
And I've always thought it was nuts because I live in central Michigan. Our main grocery store is Meijer. It's out of Grand Rapids. It's our Walmart. And we have the largest lamb kill plant, Wolverine, down in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. But all the lamb at Meijer's from Australia. And it's because of price point and cost. And so often what we see happen in the U.S. is that we bring in lean grind from Australia or lean meat from Australia, and we'll blend it with domestic fat from the United States. And that's a lot of times what you see in grass-fed burger, where it's kind of a combination of U.S. and Australian products that go into making a blend.
That makes me shake my head for a wide range of reasons, but I think I'll keep my
Oh,
commentary to myself on
yeah.
that one.
And
Yeah.
and I think that's like, I tell you, the biggest proponent of domestic grass fed that I know is Will Harris, and
Yeah.
I've done LCA work. I've done a lot of work. I've gone to Africa with Will and survived. I could tell stories, but and there's a reason behind that, right? Because he wants, and we should all collectively want to see our domestic producers thrive. And we live in an international world, and our supply chains think internationally. They don't think just domestically, right? And so it adds a lot of complication, you know. And I've always thought that I won't be anti-import, but if it helps a system provide beef 365 days a year, but I always hope it would be in a way that could purchase greater amounts of domestic product over time. But that might be too purist and naive of a premise.
Well, I've always been fascinated by macroeconomics, and I've spent quite some time studying raw materials economics. And I think, as I understand it, and as I've understood it for a while, if you want an economy to do well, then you need to compensate the raw materials producers well. Those are farmers, fishermen, lumber, mining, etc. It's those foundational raw materials producers. And if we want to protect our economy, then we have to protect the pricing that our raw materials producers receive. And so I think there's a whole conversation we
Well,
could be having around that.
we could all agree then that 10 to 11 cents out of the dollar at the farm gate is not near enough.
No, it's not. And I
And that's
think,
what's happening today.
yeah, and if you also look at thriving economies that have thrived for the long term that were not debt-based economies, people were spending significantly more than 10 or 12% or 15% of their take-home income on food. It was more in the
Absolutely.
25 to 30% range.
Absolutely. And we may be headed back there.
Well, if we're headed back there for the right reasons, farmers could thrive, but
Right.
it's debatable whether we're headed there for the right reasons.
I came across some studies thinking about multiplier effects. And um, University of Kentucky's done a lot of great work in that space. But they basically showed for every dollar spent on, like, for every dollar spent in a local beef economy, it can add $3 to $4 of a multiplier effect to that local economy.
Yep.
And I think that, you know, uh, we tend to think about like the four corners of rural America, right? It's a Dollar General, a Tractor Supply, a John Deere dealer, and a McDonald's.
Yikes.
And that's kind of what's happened, right? And I worked some with McDonald's. I'll be completely transparent. If I can help McDonald's make a difference, I will. Um,
Absolutely.
but what I want to say is that it also um, shows that, much of rural America has been extracted,
Yep.
and the fact is that I don't blame the people at McDonald's. Okay, John, it's just a function of how things have evolved, right?
People
It's
generally don't have bad intent.
no, it's just the fact that um, our economy is evolved into this extractive low cost system that doesn't account for unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences in rural America are human health, soil health, and overall well being.
Yeah, and overall, wealth and well-being. If you go back, I'll just make one more comment on raw materials economics. Your comment about a dollar in a rural community turning over 3 to 4 times per year. Charles Walters was a champion of raw materials economics when he founded, and he had a degree in economics, as I understand it, and was part of the reason for his selecting the phrase of eco-agriculture to be the tagline for Acres USA. He said that in order for agriculture to be ecological, it first must be economical. And so he studied this in depth, and has a fascinating book titled Unforgiven. And the book is a bit dated. It was before the technology era. I suspect technology might change some of the math a little bit, but there was a period of decades. I want to say from the 1920s, 30s, somewhere in there was when his data first started. He compiled data for and up through the 70s or 80s, somewhere in there. For that entire time period, the overall economy of the US was precisely 7x annually of what they paid their raw materials producers collectively. So, a different way of saying that is for every dollar you pay your farmers, your miners, lumber, forestry, and fisheries, every dollar turns over 7 times in the economy in a year. And so, if you want to have a thriving economy, you simply pay your raw materials producers very well. And the more poorly you pay them, the less well your economy is going to do generally.
Absolutely. And then it concentrates wealth.
Yeah.
And I think that's what. And look, I'm not a communist or anything, dude. Okay, I mean, or socialist or whatnot. But what I am saying though is that it is, and I think maybe this is a good bridge into ecosystem opportunities as well, right? That farmers can not only produce quality food over time, but they can also, produce healthy and clean soil and land and water and
Yep.
biodiversity and all these other things that have been diminished markedly since the Green Revolution.
Because they were
There's
externalized costs.
a huge opportunity that our farmers and ranchers are standing on in their land
Yep.
that should beckon greater financial opportunity as well.
Yeah, these have all been externalized costs historically from a macroeconomic context. I do want to go there with you, Jason, how we can monitor and measure these things and possibly monetize them in the future. But before I go there, a couple of pieces that I want to wrap up on the nutrient density piece. One is I'd like to ask you about, I don't know to what degree you're familiar with this, but years ago I had a conversation with Chris Nichols where she described some work that she participated in, I think out of Pennsylvania somewhere, where they were documenting ergothioneine movement through the food system, where you have soil fungal populations that produce ergothioneine. It's absorbed by the forages and then transferred into meat and milk. Have you looked at that at all? Or familiar with that at all? No.
That's not. No, that's a kind of a riveting uh, comment there, but I haven't, and I haven't done that. No,
All right. Well, we're going to have more conversations about that later.
that's cool, man.
All right. So the ecosystem services,
Mhm.
regenerating landscapes, carbon capture deep. By the way, I think, I get approached regularly by people who ask me, what's my opinion or what's my perspective on climate change? As if though they're incapable of forming their own opinion on by themselves or having their own opinion. There's a lot of debate around cause. Is it is mankind causing it? Is it caused by higher levels of carbon dioxide? Is it caused by solar cycles and solar particle flux? And there's lots of contention. Is it caused by shifted water cycles? But regardless of the one thing, the one thing that we all agree on the solution.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter what you believe the cause is. We generally collectively agree that the solution is sequestering carbon, maybe for different reasons. Maybe the reason to sequester carbon is so that we can stabilize the small water cycle, so that we can regreen the earth and have more vegetation. Whatever the drivers are, we all understand and agree that regenerative agriculture or landscape management to regreen it and to sequester carbon in the system is the driver, or is kind of it's the nexus point that we can all agree on. So how do we, as similar to what you've been, how you've been evaluating nutrient density, I've heard from others that you've also been evaluating the relative impact of different types of forage and grazing management and so forth. So how do we manage our livestock ecosystems for maximum ecosystem impact?
Oh, great question. So I go back to what I've learned from Alan Savory, and we for many years our farm was a savory hub. We are no longer now, but the point I would like to make is that it all goes back to management, and we can wave our hands in the air and scream climate change, uh, but only until we truly address our lack of management of our landscapes are we going to add resilience for our future generations. And uh, what I've learned from Alan specifically, right, is understanding how to look at what ecosystem processes are most broken. We've got our water cycle, we have our energy flow, we have our community dynamics, and we have our mineral cycle. And a unfortunate example would be what's happening in California as you and I speak. Los Angeles and the Palisades are on fire. And we all can be armchair quarterbacks, right? And point to where things have gone south. I don't want to do that. But what I want to say, though, is that we obviously understand that there's been dilapidated water cycles in very arid environments for a considerably great amount of time. But we choose to look at this as a CO2 issue and an energy issue and choose to remedy it with solar panels and windmills and electric cars, right? And it's a misappropriation of understanding cause and effect. And as we think about landscapes, every farm's different. It's every farm is a fingerprint, right? It's all different. And when it comes to the opportunity of using livestock as a tool to regenerate landscapes, it is different from West Texas to North Michigan or Ohio, because in each context, different ecosystem processes may be broken or may be impaired. And what we've done at our place in a very very humid, temperate environment is to begin to look at how management has influenced these ecosystem services. And what I've learned, I believe, is like probably one of the biggest drivers in all this is carbon inputs and how we put forages back down on that litter surface is probably as big of a driver as anything. How we feed the microbes, how we cover ground, how we recycle nutrients in these landscapes. And I can show you right now where we've got eddy covariate flux towers on our farms. And John, these towers measure CO2 uptake in real time. And I can show you when I use density and I use long recovery periods. And what we can see is 1 to 2 ton differences in CO2 absorption annually as compared to a prescriptive kind of continuous grazing approach. We can see it in real time. And what are those drivers? I firmly believe it's how we provide inputs back into that system. And now in a Western environment, it may be different. It may be using hooves to break a crust to allow moisture to be able to be more aptly taken up. That helps keep a water cycle functioning greater. Alejandro and some of these rock stars you see down in the Chihuahuan Desert are doing that, right? And so what we've done in our place, we've measured carbon for 12 years. When I started, I inherited like this really conventional system. First thing we did is we stockpiled as much grass as we could, and we pounded it using 150 to 300,000 pounds of density. And within about a 4 or 5 year period, we picked up about 3 tons of carbon sequestered annually. As we followed that up to about 12, 13 years now, it's tapered. But we're still hitting 0.5 to 0.7 to 0.8, somewhere in there. And actually, it have got a paper on the verge of going out that in 12 years in our system, we can actually show that all the beef we produced is without question a net sink. Now, that's my context in Michigan. It may be different elsewhere. And so I don't want to say what I do works anywhere else. It works where I live.
Well, I think the way that I would frame it is that the principle works in any context. You have to figure out what the local application might look like to
Right.
implement those principles. So let's go back, Jason. I'm fascinated by CO2 flux towers because I've been it's been my persuasion for quite some time that carbon dioxide is actually the limiting factor in plant development and crop development much more frequently than we might recognize because it tends to be out of sight, out of mind. When a plant is deficient in water, we see the symptoms very quickly. We see plant growth slowing down very quickly. But we tend to not be paying a lot of attention to carbon dioxide flux. And so um, in long presentations or workshops that I've been giving in the past, I've been talking about how to manage carbon dioxide flow from soil biology and background atmosphere, and how plants go through this 24-hour rhythm, circadian cycle of carbon dioxide absorption. And recently, in the last couple of years, growers have been using carbon dioxide towers and putting them into tree fruit canopies and putting them into vegetable crops and observing the exact types of fluctuations that I speculated would be happening, and also observing the fluctuations based on what was happening with soil microbiology. And
Mhm.
so I'm excited to see the data and to hear the story, but I'm not particularly familiar with carbon dioxide flux towers, and I'm imagining most of our listeners are not either. Can you tell us a little bit about what do they measure exactly, and what do they show?
And so actually what they're measuring, John, is all the energy coming in and out of the system. So if I can capture, so I've got all this energy coming down. So then I have
You're referring to
basic
solar energy.
solar energy.
Yep.
Typically, I think it's less than 10% of that evolves into photosynthetically active radiation. It's actually taken in by a photon in the leaf of a plant. And a chloroplast taking it up. And so basically, what I can do is I can measure all the energy in and energy out. And when I can do that, I can then convert that into a biophysical formula that basically converts that into CO2 equivalent, CO2 increments. So as long as we know the amount of energy coming in and out of a system, and we call them eddy covariant flux towers because they CO2 kind of spins in a system like an eddy in a river, right? That kind of when you see the feather just sitting there and it's spinning over and over, kind of in a pool on a river, and so as long as we close our energy budget, then we know how much CO2 is being absorbed versus emitted. And there's challenges to these systems, right? Because I can't have a highway by me. I can't have a bunch of trees over me. I can't have hills around me. So I can put them in these kind of benign 10-acre blocks. I've got 60 plus, our team has 60 plus of these out throughout the United States monitoring. And, um, and so it gives you more real time information on what's happening with energy capture and that energy flow through your system, which important component of that is the amount of CO2 we're absorbing right into the system for photosynthetic activity. And and the beauty of these is that we don't have to wait 5 or 7 years or 10 years
Right.
to see what's potentially sequestered. The challenges in them are a lot of the challenges that we see are being able to capture what's happening at night because you've got a system that's absorbing energy all day, and then at night we see burped CO2 go back up. Right as things get cooler, we basically have a diffused gradient where we see CO2 go back up. Right, and being able to capture that accurately, and all these little nuances that go on. But I tell you, I think that as they get less expensive, I think they're a very important tool. The last thing I'll say on these, and it really is always an issue, is often they don't match what we measure with soil carbon underground. That um, there are differences in a lot of areas where the CO2 flux towers give you one answer, where the soil carbon sequestration may give you another. And so I
How
try to
wildly
mediate
variable are
those.
they?
Um, there's some papers that can get an R squared of like 0.7, 70% correlated. Others might be 0.2 or 0.3, which is pretty suspect, right?
Yep.
And so there could be great variation. Now, whether it's we're not taking enough soil carbon samples, whether we're not going deep enough, or I
Right.
mean, it's Pandora's box, and that's the unfortunates of chasing carbon as a metric. Honestly, carbon it's impossible to measure. I
Right.
think. I mean, it's
Well,
just
it's a cycle.
it's so challenging. But unfortunately, we put a dollar bill on it, and so it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out.
Where do you see the opportunity for farming? You started this conversation by mentioning the opportunities that you hope to exist in the future for ecosystem services. How do you
Mhm.
see that shaping up?
Um, well, you talked about raw commodities, and I don't know what a barrel of oil is today, but generally I've done the math, and if you take enough barrels of oil to equal a ton of carbon, it's about $400. Meaning that oil has $400 worth of, whatever the oil price is per barrel, and what percent of that barrel is carbon, a majority of it. It normally equates to around $400 a ton. But typically we've only paid a farmer 10 or 20 bucks to put it back. And there's a huge discrepancy in what we pay someone to extract it versus replenish it. For this to work, I think those two numbers have to have a little more balance. I think that you can't, for supply and demand, you can't ask a farmer to, at a loss, put carbon back. And often the tools and technologies we know that can do that have costs associated with them, but there have been very little payback for the farmer to do so.
Right. Exactly.
I think that if we take the latest IRA bill, there's like a $90 tax credit on a ton of CO2. Okay. I think there's uh, 1 ton of carbon is like 3.67 tons of CO2. Okay. If I remember the math. So there are opportunities we're seeing evolve that this carbon may be worth more. But somebody's got to pay for it. Who's going to do it? And that's where I see the logjam.
Yeah. And well, anyway, I am interested by the carbon conversation. It'd be interesting to get into it, but I also know that if we get into it very far, it's such a wild west right now, and who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it significantly? And are farmers going to be given the opportunity to be rewarded for the work that they're doing? Or are they also going to be penalized disproportionately
Mhm.
for the use of nitrogen fertilizers and inappropriate accounting of insects and on the list goes? But that's perhaps a bigger conversation. Of Jason, of all the things that you're working on, you have a lot going on at any one moment. What are the things that you're most excited about?
I lead a $19 million project, working with a few co-directors, Jeff Goodwin at A&M, Francesca Catrufo, who's one of the world's best soil health scientists that I know, and Noble Research Institute as well. And we're working on 60 ranches throughout the U.S. right now, and learning to see what is driving improved ecosystem function from a grazing management perspective. And over that period of time, I work with about 45 scientists that are doing remote sensing work, that are doing water cycling, the whole gamut, John. And seeing the opportunities of bringing these quantitative metrics to bear in new updated models that are more predictive. Modeling, I say modelers rule and ruin the world simultaneously. And and some of my best friends are modelers. Okay. And that's where we always see it. It's kind of quasi epidemiology. And we could go down that rabbit hole if we
Yep.
wanted to. But there is no way to accurately measure 1 million acres at one time.
Yep.
And there are supply chains that have tens of millions of acres in them. So we have to be what I say, top down, bottom up, meet farmers in the middle. And it's going to be a combination of technology and modeling and updated remote sensing. I think the number is every day there's like 20 or so satellites that take a picture of your farm every day. There's like 20 of them a day now that go over. It's
And that
crazy.
number's only going up.
We can go to the eco stress sensor on the space station and measure ET, evapotranspiration, at about a 90% clip than what I can measure them with the eddy covariant flux tower on the ground, which is a 90% relationship from space is pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, it really is. Wow.
So in environments where water is the stressor and ET is compromised, I've got an accurate lever now in space to predict what's happening at the ground level. In environments where ET is not the limiter, where it may be nutrients or energy or other things, it isn't as accurate. But the point is that we're on the cusp of combining massive technologies with on-ground monitoring to create the most updated and improved models of measuring ecosystem function that we've ever had. So therefore, how we marry that to what farmers and ranchers do on the ground to pay them more is kind of where we're after on this big project. And that motivates me. It excites me. I put out fires. I'm a quasi administrator. I put out fires every day. But having the opportunity to work on these 60 ranches is really a big impact.
Well, always the piece that has moved us forward is new information. Not new ideas, but new information, new facts, new things that we've learned about how the system works, new observations. And so I think the work you're doing is very necessary for us to continue to progress and to continue to move forward and implementing at scale some of the things that experience shows us works well, but understanding how to refine those and make them work well at scale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. I agree fully.
Well, Jason, I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, for the work you're doing. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and experience. And you've given a lot of people something to think about. Grass finishing beef in the last 60 days. There'll be lots of conversations coming your way. Just be forewarned.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I appreciate it, and been a fan of yours, John. I'm glad we're finally getting together, and I'm sure we'll see you down the road, sir.
All right. Thank you.
You bet.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you.